Hi, I'm Diane Bada. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about spiritual bypass. This is something that you've probably seen in somebody, whether it's an acquaintance or a friend or maybe even a family member, but many times people don't know the term for it. In this video, I'm going to give a bit more context, explain what it is, what it tends to look like, how it tends to show up. Also tends to be something that can show up in individuals who have experienced trauma but are still in the avoidance phase. So let's get started. Spiritual bypass generally refers to the avoidance of emotional and psychological issues by using spirituality or spiritual practices, sometimes overdoing spiritual practices. It is a term that was coined in the 1980s. It was coined by psychologist John Welwood, and essentially he coined it when he noticed that some people in the spiritual settings that he was in were not really engaging with practices in the proper context, and as a result were kind of using them to avoid their own issues. Obviously, as a psychologist, he would probably be more attuned to observing this or seeing this than others might. This, however, isn't limited to Eastern spiritual practices or New Age spiritual practices. You can see this in secular meditation practices. You can see it in mainstream religions as well. But for the purposes of this video, we will talk about it more in the context of Eastern spiritual practices, maybe Buddhism, yoga, etc. Spiritual bypass oftentimes can represent a broader trend or a desire for a quick fix. This is something that we tend to see a lot in Western culture, and that may explain one reason why it has caught on in the way that it has, or why you tend to see it so much. Simply put, spiritual bypass is a defense mechanism. It is a way of avoiding things. It's also closely related to emotional repression. So sometimes people are not really raised in a household that talks about emotions or encourages their exploration. And this can lead to emotions being seen as something that are messy or inconvenient. What is ironic, though, is that with individuals who tend to repress their emotions or distance themselves from their emotions, those emotions tend to be a lot stronger and they can be a lot more disruptive because these people never really learn the tools to work through them, to understand why they're present, or to also understand that they will fade over time, that most emotions generally will peak in intensity and then gradually get weaker. Some of the common manifestations of spiritual bypass, the way that it tends to show up, can be things like, number one, toxic positivity. So you've probably heard this term, right? This refers to somebody who gets very upset or discouraged or doesn't like any expression of negative emotions. There are entire companies, entire workplaces where this is something that is fostered. Generally, though, you will see a person in a situation or in a company where toxic positivity is present, being shamed or shunned even if they express frustration with something or express discouragement with something. They'll be told that they are not a team player, not positive, etc. But that can be an example of spiritual bypass. Another example would be the tendency to use spiritual concepts or jargon to dismiss or avoid dealing with a personal issue. For example, somebody might say that they are choosing to let go instead of dealing with a situation that really needs to be confronted and worked through, which will probably make things more complicated in the long run. Another way that it tends to manifest is in a lack of emotional intelligence or maturity. This is pretty simple. If you are accustomed to avoiding your emotions and not dealing with them, you're not going to have much in terms of skills in order to be able to confront them and to understand them and to manage them on your own. So you may come across as a bit emotionally immature or even emotionally stunted. Another way it can show up is in using spiritual terms to justify behaviors that are kind of mean or harmful. For instance, a person might say that they are choosing not to commit to a relationship because they want to remain non-attached, or they are leaning into the concept of unattachment. This can hurt somebody, and it may not be totally honest. So that is another way that it can show up. The last thing that you tend to commonly see is a lack of empathy, maybe for the suffering of other people, and referring to that as somebody's karma. This is something that relates to their past life experiences. Most people would see that as just being kind of callous or crude, but it is a way that some people might be engaging in spiritual bypass. Consequences. So we think of the consequences of spiritual bypass. One major one can be a lack of deep relationships. As I just mentioned, individuals who engage in spiritual bypass tend to not really be in touch with their emotions. And this can make it hard for them to form deep relationships with other people. Usually we bond by sharing our struggles, frustrations, vulnerabilities. And if an individual is not really capable of doing that, they're going to come off as a little bit maybe hollow or superficial or just plain weird. People might not feel comfortable connecting to them or confiding much in them, and they may feel isolated as a result. Another consequence can be a disillusionment with spirituality. So if you are using spiritual practices to avoid things, this takes away from the actual meaning or their actual true intention. So people might find that, they've been doing all of these meditation classes or yoga classes and they're only getting worse. It must mean that none of these practices are beneficial. That is so far from the truth. However, if you're not utilizing something in the way that it's meant to be utilized, of course it's not going to be very effective. What is interesting about spiritual bypass is that you tend to see it a lot in individuals who've gone through something traumatic but haven't yet found the sense of safety that is needed to work through that trauma. It's also something that can explain why you see so many scandals popping up in the world of yoga, meditation. You see leaders who are kind of hungry for power in these settings because they might attract people who are using these practices to avoid their own issues or avoid their shadow self or the desires that they don't allow themselves to acknowledge. So those leaders who take advantage of people in these settings are perfect examples of spiritual bypass. To sum up, spiritual bypass is a form of avoidance using spirituality. It was something that was discovered by John Wellwood in the 1980s, a psychologist. And some of the main manifestations that you will see include toxic positivity, a tendency to use spiritual terms to dismiss or avoid personal issues that need to be worked through, a lack of emotional maturity, using spiritual terms to maybe justify harmful behavior in a relationship, and a lack of empathy for the suffering of other people. I hope that this was helpful and maybe provided some clarity on an issue or a topic that you've probably seen but didn't really know how to refer to. So stay tuned for more.